Hello and welcome back to News from Nowhere, Scotia's weekly news podcast tracing the headlines shaping Scottish politics. My name is Coll McCail. Today is Monday the 29th of June and I'm joined by Rory Hamilton. Rory, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Cole. Recovering from a busy weekend. Yourself?
Very well, very well. Once again, we don't have Sam, but he will, I promise, be back next week. We've got a lot to get through today. We're going to be talking about the fallout from Keir Starmer's resignation and what it means for Scotland. We're going to be talking, as ever, about shifting sands in the Scottish economy and maybe a little bit about that demoralising exit from the World Cup. But before we do that, a couple of headlines for you. And before we even get to the headlines, one last plug for our Patreon. If you have as little as £5 a month spare at the end of the month, you can support Scotia and help us produce this podcast. If you don't, then leave us a review wherever you're listening. It really helps us with the algorithm. And as ever, there is a link to our WhatsApp channel and our mailing list in the show notes. That's the best way to stay up to date with what we are doing at Scotia. We launched a fundraiser a couple of weeks ago to promote our post-election coverage, and it's done very, very well. Thanks again to all those who have joined the Patreon. If you're one of them, we really, really appreciate it. And if you're not and you're thinking about it, hopefully this podcast will be enough to convince you that it is worth your while. Without further ado, let's crack on with the headlines this week. And Rory, let's change things up. Let's go to you first.
Yeah, and for me, so it's an external consulting firm has been given a contract by the University of Edinburgh to help manage its academic shape and size in the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. The firm has been paid around about £200,000, but this comes in the context of some significant cuts to Edinburgh University's teaching staff and staff more broadly. The university has been warned by the UCU, the University and College Union, that as many as 1,400 jobs could be lost in the bid to save 140 million. And I think, yeah, it's pretty shocking, especially given we already know Peter Matheson doesn't know what his own salary is, even though it's also in the six-figure region. But yeah, fairly shocking that the university would find money for a consultancy firm to find more ways of finding money. Whilst was getting rid of the only people who actually do the delivering of their jobs. What about you, Cole?
Yes, quite shocking, but hardly surprising. I have an entirely different headline to lead with today, and that's the news that sewage leaked into Scottish waters at least 23,672 times in 2025, discharging, wait for it, 22 billion litres of wastewater into rivers, lochs and seas. The Sunday Mail reported yesterday that that would be enough to fill 9,000 Olympic swimming pools. And of course, this comes amidst a heat wave which will see more Scots swim in our natural water and is really rather grim stuff. And it's grim stuff particularly because I think we talk about water management and water control in the context of south of the border quite a lot, but very rarely, because Scottish Water is nationalised perhaps, do we talk about accountability up here. And what's referred to in the context of these new statistics across the headlines is the fact that there's an old and very dated late 90s piece of regulation which says that in the aftermath of storm flows, raw sewage can be allowed to flow into natural water. And I think that that's a pretty grim bit of guidance as these freak weather events and heavy rainfall become more and more frequent with climate change, something that's going to have to change. And yet here we are, and perhaps we don't talk about it as much as we should, but nonetheless a pretty frightening statistic, that 22 billion litres of wastewater from sewage into Scotland's natural landscape. Yeah, really rather shitty. Sorry, had to make the joke at some point. Rory, I'll throw back to you.
Yeah, I'm sticking with universities, and this one is particularly close to me as a researcher at the University of Glasgow, which announced this week it's opened a voluntary severance scheme, and it was particularly targeted over the drop in international postgraduate students being forecast, which I think highlights this real sort of unsustainable a funding model which universities are clinging to these days. I think the context to add to this is that Andy Schofield, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Glasgow, not long ago, I believe in the last month, has defended his pay package of £319,000 a year, whilst his employees are facing redundancies, and the graduate teaching assistants have also seen cuts to their budgets in this College of Social Sciences. Pretty grim across the whole university sector, especially in the context of University of Strathclyde job cuts, GCU job cuts, Dundee University, Aberdeen. I think the fact that the list goes on really highlights this. And of course, we covered this on a previous Nesta Fearties episode. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to it again soon, because I don't think this is going to come to a head anytime soon. This is perhaps just the start. Coll, what about you on your last items?
Yeah, barely any institution is safe at the moment when it comes to Scottish higher education. So I'm going to pivot again to the Saxavord spaceport on the island of Unst in Shetland, which is, of course, as we know, owned by Anders Poulsen, Scotland's richest man, the Dane who founded ASOS. And this is the news reported extensively and very well by the Ferret, that the Saxavord spaceport has applied for a sea dumping license, which would allow the port to chuck disused rocket components effectively into the sea north of Shetland over the next 12 months and longer. So this is really quite dystopian stuff, especially when you consider the fact that, according to the Ferret's report, Saxavord have been lobbying the Scottish government considerably over the last number of months to enable this licence to be approved. They've also been pressing, as have other companies within Scotland's budding space industry, if we're going to call it that, for the free port, or the introduction of a free port in Saxavord, so that companies could benefit from tax breaks and deregulation. Of course, Scotland already has two so-called green free ports at the Firth of Forth and Cromarty Firth. This would be a third, and it is what the multinationals who are involved up at Saxavord are begging for. We should also note, I think, that Saxavord asked in their correspondence with the Scottish Government when they were lobbying for their sea dumping licence, for their application to be kept as quiet as possible. So this is actually really quite sinister stuff. I think that often, because of where Saxavord is, we aren't across the details of what's going on there, but it's a serious project where a lot of money is being spent and a lot of power is being amassed. So you never know, Rory. Go for a swim on Scotland's north coast, and not only will you be swimming across shit-filled water, but you may encounter some, I don't know, turbo boosters or whatever. Shows how little I know about rockets, but some disused rocket components. So grim news for our waterways this week, I suppose, is the crux of my headlines. I have got one more, but I'll throw back to you.
Sure, yeah, I'm worried about the potential sixth finger I might grow if I head up that way anytime soon.
I will have to cut that bit out.
Yeah, for me, my last item is Kate Forbes this week, or last week, attended the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference in London, an event put together, I believe, by the sort of pseudo-philosopher Jordan Peterson, made famous for his comments about men's mental health, but with a particular right-wing to far-right slant. Kate Forbes was talking about her role as a Christian in politics, saying Christian viewpoints were being squeezed out of UK politics, and particularly highlighted in her speech saying that she felt under pressure to lie about her faith during the 2023 SNP leadership contest. This was while she was sharing a panel with notorious liar Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, as well as other significant right-wing figures like anti-trans writer Julie Bindel, Kate Hoey, Kemi Badenoch even made an appearance there. And I think it's significant that a potential First Minister of the country, or historically potential First Minister, was attending this fairly rancid panel of views down in London. And I think it's an odd choice for her to make post a career. I don't think she has much to gain from talking about her Christian faith being a positive aspect in this sort of coalition of people who have fairly regressive views about the world as that we live in, and how they see the world should be going forward. I don't think it's fair to say that Christian views are being squeezed out of UK politics. I think we are being we live in a world in the UK anyway that is still shaped by a lot of Christian views, and I think even in the left that there's good Christian socialists out there, Ross Greer being one, who would label himself as such. But I think this is an odd intervention from Kate Forbes, although maybe not, perhaps not that surprising. Maybe I'm slightly too optimistic. Coll, what's your last point?
Yeah, the Spectator didn't call Kate Forbes Milton McFriedman for nothing when she was running for leader of the party. Although the SSP probably topped them at the time by calling her what did they say? Wee free marketeer. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, we free. Yeah, that was great.
Yes. So anyway, moving on to the protracted now debate about Scottish Labour's response to the 2026 election results. Monica Lennon, former MSP, has weighed in by suggesting that the party could break with the broader Labour Party down south. In comment made on the BBC Sunday show yesterday, she said, "It's not for Andy Burnham or a Prime Minister to decide, or a leader of UK Labour. What we need to do within Scottish Labour is have more control over our own destiny, and over the summer that will be led by Anna Sarwar and Jackie Baillie here in Scotland." She was asked if Scottish Labour breaking away from the UK party would be considered, and Monica Lennon said, "That's an option, and really nothing is off the table." Personally, I think placing too much faith in Anna Sarwar and Jackie Baillie's ability to think critically about the Scottish Labour's performance in May, but nonetheless it is an interesting intervention which continues the hamster wheel going on what Scottish Labour are going to do post-election. It comes in the context of this Make Scottish Labour Scottish campaign being launched by a 2026 election candidate to break that link between the party and the Labour Party south of the border. I mean, it should be said that though instinctively we would support a move like this, Rory, I think there is like a whole lot of complications regarding funding, because Scottish Labour is, as we well know, is essentially subsidised by the party south of the border. But we should move on to our substantive stories, which link very nicely to what we've just spoken about, and that is the fallout from Keir Starmer's resignation as Prime Minister and Andy Burnham's gradual ascendance. It looks pretty likely that Burnham will be Prime Minister next month, and as part of the preparation for taking on the top job is putting together his cabinet prior to being elected Labour leader. There have already been some controversial appointments. The return of James Purnell, of course, moving directly from Flint Global, the multinational consultancy firm, back to Number 10 to become Burnham's chief of staff, being just one, the new beginning to look like the old already. But one place where Burnham does seem somewhat determined to make a change is in Number 11 Downing Street, where Rachel Reeves looks to be on her way out as Chancellor. There are a few names circulating about who the former Mayor of Manchester might select to succeed her. Wes Streeting is one, and crucially, Ed Miliband, the current Energy Secretary, is another. Now, that news has been met by the Scottish National Party with derision. The SNP have said Ed Miliband must not be made Chancellor of the Exchequer. The party put out a press release in the name of Kirsty Blackman last week, who is of course an Aberdeen MP, which read as follows: "Miliband has destroyed 1,000 energy jobs a month, and the Labour Party wants to make him Chancellor. That's the Westminster way: control of our energy and contempt for workers." The SNP don't just want Ed Miliband to not be appointed Chancellor, they want him gone from his energy brief as Well, this is an interesting development. We've talked a lot about the direction of the SNP at Westminster in recent weeks. Rory, what did you make of the SNP's opposition to the idea that Red Ed might take the reins at the Treasury?
I think this, if anything, highlights the rightward pivot of the SNP. The fact that I think there's a broader point to be made about what Ed Miliband would do as Chancellor, what he's already done as Energy Secretary, and there seems to be a sort of battle for the soul of the Labour Party going on a little bit, a battle between two people who are very similar or two factions, should I say, which are largely similar, certainly in comparison to the rest of us on the wider left. And I think for the SNP to sort of take a side in this and to take a side on the right is quite a step change from the Sturgeon days of no more oil and gas drilling. And I think, if anything, it signals how taken by current trends they are, as in they're very responsive to what the headlines are and what they see as politically expedient in the news, without actually adding much substance beyond the depth to that, and actually without thinking about the broader picture here. Now, I think if the battle for what the Labour Party under Andy Burnham looks like is between Ed Miliband and a streetingist streak, shall we say, then Ed Miliband is certainly the more progressive option and something that we should. I think if there's any hope of this Labour government turning itself around, it comes from Ed Miliband. I think I've said already on the podcast that he's actually one of the few ministers who's got stuff done and seems to know his way around getting things done. And commentators often talk up his knowledge of the Treasury, his ability to go in and actually direct civil servants, which by all reports I hear coming even from the Scottish government actually, is that a lot of the time ministers come into their brief, and because they lack a deep set ideology or a deep set understanding of the issues, and perhaps this is also related to the fact that ministers stay in a role for a much shorter period of time than they might have done previously. They often are led by the civil servants, and for civil servants, the default is the status quo, which means not changing anything. And so, by all accounts, by all reports coming through about Ed Miliband's approach, he does direct civil servants, and he does tell them how he thinks things should be done and what changes need to be made. And I think that's really crucial. And I think the New Statesman have actually done some very good reporting about the sort of Andy Burnham rise. And in that context, I've talked about how Ed Miliband is the one who's putting the constraints on Andy Burnham's ambitions. Andy Burnham is the one that wants to be doing things and changing. And Ed Miliband is thinking, quote unquote, pragmatically about how to go about doing those things. So taking that point a step further, thinking about the SNP's opposition to a pragmatic politician says a lot about the SNP, that they don't think holistically. They don't think about a broader industrial strategy and the actual steps it takes to get work done, right? And it really speaks to their sort of government by press release approach that they've had for a number of years now. So I think it's a damning indictment of the SNP. I do, like, if I'm putting any money on a horse here, I really do hope it is Ed Miliband, for the sake of everybody. If it's going to be anything, I also sort of have a disregard for this media culture that seems to think that leadership candidates ought to offer their opponents a position in whatever cabinet as a means of reconciling this sort of like rest of politics style, agreeing disagreeably, we can all be friends in cabinet together. I don't think that's ever necessarily been the case. Why would Andy Burnham want to appoint Wes Streeting to probably the other most significant role in the cabinet, when he's already been shown to be a sort of backstabbing little shit, really? Maybe you might have to take that out for libel, but yeah. I think it's entirely bizarre to want to offer him that. Coll, what was your take on this before I drag on too long?
I think it's really interesting. I think, like, as you quite correctly say, the SNP weighing into the battle for one of the 4 offices of the British state, or top offices of the British state, is quite surprising for Scottish nationalists who should want nothing to do with the psychodrama of Westminster, and that is in fact what they say quite often. I guess the question for Kirsty Blackman is, who would she rather take that job? Would she rather it was Wes Streeting? Would she leave Rachel Reeves in place, the woman who the party has consistently derided for failing to lift the 2-child benefit cap immediately, for cutting winter fuel, for cutting payments? Is that who the SNP would like to stay in number 11 Downing Street? Have they got an alternative candidate? Maybe they'd like John Healey to take over, given his love-in for the defence industry, which, as we know, they now share. So I think that it is, exactly as you say, evidence of this short-termism and the absence of a broader strategy, right? They are moving from one thing to another at pace just now, the SMT, without a coherent approach or a coherent communication strategy. And I think this is the result of that. There is, I think, also something to say about this coming in the aftermath of the Aberdeen defeat, the defeat which saw Richard Thompson, the SNP's candidate, beaten at that by-election by Douglas Lumsden of the Conservative Party, who ran very heavily, hammering home the SNP's opposition to further oil and gas extraction, and benefited accordingly from that. At least they claim to have done so. I think the SNP have panicked as a result and disassociated themselves even further from anything that might be considered green, which is, as we discussed last week, exactly what they need not to do. What they need to do is crack on with delivering a transition for workers which puts them front and centre, rather than running this absurd comms campaign which says oil and gas is fantastic and going to be around for decades to come. I mean, to accuse Ed Miliband, as Kirsty Blackman did in her comments, of being responsible for the loss of 1,000 jobs every month in the Northeast is just absurd. The decline in employment in the northeast of Scotland's oil and gas sector began long before 2020, never mind before Ed Miliband became Chancellor. So I think that this is the wrong approach. I think it's the wrong response to Aberdeen. I think that if you read actually Richard Thompson's column in The National this week, where he sort of attempts to explain why he thinks the party lost that by-election, he says exactly what Kirsty Blackman says, in the sense that the energy profits levy introduced by the Tories is exactly the thing which is killing North Sea oil and gas, which is an absurd position, outflanking the Conservative Party to the right on multinational corporate taxation. Patently absurd for a party that still claims on its website to be socially democratic. So I think that this is an increasingly absurd context, actually. But they're not the only ones sort of jumping in on the crusade against Ed Miliband. Both Unite and the GMB offshore trade unions have came out swinging against Miliband as Chancellor, which again I think is just absurd. So Andy Burnham is not only under pressure to his right, but he is under pressure from his left, with both the SNP and Unite certainly. But the pressure he is under from his left is to move to his right. So, I mean, any sort of narrow prospect that Burnham had of being able to implement the agenda which he has spoken so often about rhetorically, of ending 40 years of neoliberalism, is being handicapped not just by the Labour right at the moment, but is being handicapped by the social democratic left within, supposedly social democratic left within the Scottish National Party, and to an extent within some of the unions, which is bananas, quite frankly. But we are where we are, and I suppose with that we should move on to our second story, which is very much linked to the question of whether Andy Burnham will be able to end 40 years of neoliberalism. And I say that because the Scotsman reported on Sunday that United States private equity has become the single largest source of foreign capital backing Scotland's biggest businesses. US firms now account for 39% of ownership stakes in Scotland's 500 largest companies. There are among as many ownership stakes in those companies for US companies as there are British companies, which is saying something. And among the largest private equity backers of those Scottish companies are, of course, BlackRock, Blackstone, and Apollo. Some of their leading stakes lie in companies such as Stagecoach, Neo Group, the offshore energy company, and Edinburgh Airport. none particularly surprising, but nonetheless reaffirming our status in Scotland as a vassal state. Rory, what did you make of the Scotsman's reporting?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to note about this. This was a pull-out section, and we're talking about it in a critical way, but it was certainly a pin-up piece, is highlighting that this was a boon to the Scottish economy, right? Which tells you something about Scotland's media landscape, and I guess reinforces our Patreon drive, if you want an independent media. Um, I think there's a few key statements which come out of this, which uh, I found interesting. And Coll, you might be more interested in the sort of breakdown of the numbers and who owns what where. But for me, I found it really, really interesting that ownership is concentrated in the industrial infrastructure and energy asset sectors. Um, and that in the same breath, the headline article cautions that founders lose appetite for external investment once they reach profitability, right? And I think if this is the model by which we're funding key aspects of the economy, energy infrastructure, and the big industry, um, and we are basing it off of uh, foreign capital, which seeks a quick buck. That doesn't sound like a very sustainable long-term investment strategy for developing any of those things. And that should be really concerning. We already know that Glasgow, I think, is the something like the most attractive place for foreign capital investment, um, which uh, I find highly concerning, particularly in the context. There's some good reporting from the Herald as well about the new developments in Glasgow city centre at the moment. But Marissa McWhirter rightly highlights that this it's being grounded on purpose-built student accommodation, which again seeks to extract money out. Like this is extractivist rentier economy uh, for people elsewhere, and there's nothing that we as ordinary Scots are gaining from this, right? It also links back to what we were saying about the SNP's lack of a broader vision for Scotland, that it is tied to other people's vision for investment and for development. And let's not forget what private equity actually means, is that it's about sourcing funding and borrowing money to finance individual sort of deals and things like that. And often that comes from things like pension funds, university endowments, sovereign wealth funds, as well as insurance companies and things like that. There is an alternative model. I think often by putting it out like this, it implies that it's the only way that we can finance major public projects, and that's not the case. That I mentioned pension funds as one good way of using public money to do public good. The Scottish National Investment Bank, another key institution that should be put to better use to finance big, slow returns projects that include house building. Coll, you mentioned energy and Stagecoach as being some of the companies that had their large private equity stakes in. Calla Homes and Miller Homes Group as well were also up among the highest Scotland 500 companies that had private equity investment. And the fact that house building and property development is tied to that, I don't know, it signals a warning sign. Again, if we think about the causes of the financial crash in 2008, that was a housing-based crash. And I'd highly recommend people go and have a listen to the New Statesman's podcast, actually. Just not to take space away from us, but there was a very good interview with Mariana Mazzucato, who talked about public debt versus private debt. And I think she explains it in a really eloquent way that highlights that crash came through private debt, yet we're obsessed with cutting public debt down. The role of the state is to finance these types of things, and is to take that sort of risk which the private sector doesn't want to take. And when the private sector doesn't take those risks because they're interested in profitability, the motives for good projects, sustainable projects, which are, you know, Like things in houses aren't falling apart because they don't make cheap choices, right? That is a material knock-on effect of choosing short-term profitability, and I think that's something that we need to be concerned about. So those are my top takes from it. And Coll, what was your main read?
Yeah, I think you're bang on. I think there are a couple of points which are interesting. So I think that figure, that 39% of ownership stakes in Scotland's that figure, that 39%, almost 40% of ownership stakes in Scotland's largest 500 companies on its own is staggering. That figure placed in a context where the talking points from the organised right in this country are around barriers to innovation, barriers to success in Scotland. If you listen to Tom Hunter and Willie Hawkey on their Go Radio business show that we talk about quite often on this podcast as an exemplar of some of these arguments, their line one week after another is Scotland is being held back by overregulation and an absence of will among the population to innovate, right? And then you strip it back and you find statistics like this, which prove, as you've just said, Rory, the model is broken. And perhaps what's holding Scotland back economically is that ultimately we control none of the businesses that we think we do because they're owned offshore, and that the economic levers we have access to are actually put beyond our reach by the fact that, or we should have access to, are actually put beyond our reach by the fact they're controlled in America. I think that's important to note because I think it really does cut through some of the crap around this stuff, which is designed to draw our attention away from the fact that we're in actual fact one of the most foreign-owned economies in Europe, away from the fact that 40% of our largest, most innovative businesses aren't actually ours, but owned abroad, and towards the fact that we're actually just a bit lazy as a population. So I think that's really, really crucial stuff. The second point I would like to make is around that Mingyang investment, and I know we keep coming back to it, right? But this was a £1.5 billion offshore wind factory going to be built by the Chinese wind turbine maker rather, Mingyang, off the coast of Scotland, that was blocked by the UK government on the grounds that it was Chinese and there were national security implications. Now, the national security implications that come with that one bit of Chinese investment apparently outweigh the national security implications that come with being totally dependent on American capital, totally dependent on a state which is tearing up the international playbook as we speak, totally dependent on a state breaking international law in the Middle East and Latin America routinely, totally dependent on a state which cannot be controlled, which is rogue in the very literal sense that it is out of control. And yet there is not one red flag waved about this stuff. In fact, as Rory quite rightly points out, it's pinned us to something to be proud of. Look, we're the American vassal state. So I think that this is a useful bit of reporting from the Scotsman, regardless of the context in which they want to portray it. But the fact is that it does leave our economy exposed to not just to the whims of the market, as you quite rightly say, Rory, with regard to the 2008 crash and its roots, but with regards to the attitude of the US state. We've already seen over the last 2 weeks the imposition of foreign export controls by the US government on some of these new big AI companies, preventing products being used overseas. So if this is the economy we're moving into, a more mercantilist world, we're in trouble, because ultimately we're going to be the victim of all of these decisions, because 40% of our 500 largest companies belongs to effectively the United States. So it's not a pretty picture, and one that we should pay more heed to. And on that happy note, we should end this week's podcast. Hope you've enjoyed the show. Rory and I will be back with Sam next Monday. In the meantime, you can support Scotia on Patreon for as little as the price of a pint a month. If you're listening to this show on Spotify, please give us a review. And if not, then you might want to watch us on YouTube, where News from Nowhere is available every Monday. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Rory for joining us. See you next Monday. Bye.